So I'm very happy to be here this morning and to present this work that we have been doing. And as Ola said here, I'm heading up the Network Society Lab, and we are looking into particularly the transformative effect of ICT, how ICT brings change in different sectors of society. And we have a couple of our publications available on the tables outside. I'm sure that some of you have picked up a couple of those, but those are the typical work that we are looking into. And obviously, we are aware of that cities is an increasingly important domain to look at. I mean, first of all, we have all the trends around urbanization, etc. I will not go into that. I think we all know that cities are becoming increasingly powerful and increasingly important in the world. But obviously, also cities is thereby an increasingly important domain for ICT, both on a connectivity level as well as on application and enabler layer. And that makes it important for us, we believe, to understand the development of cities deeper than just as a place for installation of equipment. And lastly, I think cities also is, in many aspects, a more relevant domain to compare with. Because if you look at, my favorite example is always compare UK with China, and the difference is quite big. Most statistics is on national level, and that makes it very hard to compare and to learn when you start to look into statistics. But when you compare London with Shanghai, for instance, maybe this equal, or the dimensions that are the same are much more relevant. So the comparison, and thereby the learning curve, if we look at cities compared to nation, can help us quite a lot to stimulate the development and to improve the speed of development. So with that said, I will, let's see, here we are. I will briefly introduce the city index and the work that we've been doing. I mean, the report looks like this, and it's available outside under the embargo that Ola talked about for you. And you have a good weekend then to spend reading that report. From sort of a design point of view, we have built the city index on the notion of the role that ICT plays in cities. And that is something I think that what Martin Ingvar told us about healthcare is a very, very good illustration, a very, very elaborate illustration of how ICT is coming in and becoming a very strong change agent in how healthcare works. And obviously we see that in many other domains. I mean, look at urban mobility, for instance, how we travel around, how we move around. ICT is becoming a very critical component in improving that experience, in helping out to reach our destination in a better fashion, and also maybe to exchange traveling for something else, a video meeting or whatever, as an alternative to traveling. And equally, you can look into some of the broader inclusion issues. You can look into energy utilities where ICT is coming into smart grids, etc. So we see that there is a very big role for ICT to play in cities. And I think that when we did this design of the index, we basically reviewed some 120 different reports, scientific reports, case studies, etc., to identify those common denominators where we see that ICT contributes. And we are focusing on that those aspects when we look into the triple bottom line perspective. And the way which we've done the index, and Ola explained that also briefly here, that we are talking about two main axes, or two main aspects of this index. One is the ICT itself, where we are looking into concepts like, I mean, ICT maturity, where we're looking into the performance of ICT in a given city from an infrastructure point of view. I mean, how well is the infrastructure performing? What is the speeds that the infrastructure provide? What is the diffusion? I mean, how propagated, how available is the infrastructure? We're looking into affordability, which in a sense is the performance of the market. I mean, how effective is the market to provide these services? And we're also looking into actual usage levels. I mean, how well are we as individuals, but also institutions and business in applying and using the ICT? So those three dimensions basically provides the information for the ICT maturity. And in total, I think we have some roughly 20 different data points in that dimension. And on the other side, we are then sort of correlating this with the triple bottom line effect, where we are grouping around social aspects, economic aspects, and environmental aspects. And those are, I think, summaries of the different areas where we see through the research that we have been going through and reviewing where ICT actually contributes. So if we talk about social, for instance, we are looking into healthcare, and how well the city is performing from a healthcare point of view. We're looking into how well the city is performing from an education point of view. We're looking how well the city is performing from an inclusion point of view. And with inclusion that goes into sort of things like crime rates, it goes into unemployment or employment rates, etc. I mean, how sort of acceptable is it to live in the city in that sense. Economically, we're looking into both the current productivity of a city, measured primarily then through GDP, but we're also looking into the future competitiveness of the city, where we are looking into the human capital, we're looking into intellectual capital being produced in the city, we are looking into high-tech sector, the size of the high-tech sector, we're looking into entrepreneurship, so we are capturing a couple of data points around what we think constitutes important aspects for the future success of the city. And then the environmental piece is a bit different from the other ones, because environmental, typically when you have a city which is not very highly developed, you typically have quite a good environmental performance. Resource consumption is low. Typically the environmental conditions, if it's land, water or air, is quite good. Also the contribution to carbon dioxide globally is also quite low. But as development starts to kick in, often the environmental performance starts to worsen. And then we can see in our research that at some point when you get to a higher level of development, we can see some signs of that the environmental indicators is actually starting to recover again. So if there is a typical pattern where ICT and social economic development follow each other, environmental is slightly different. But we believe that's an important aspect to bring into the equation. And we also believe that the environmental aspects are something which is of great concern and where ICT can contribute and for the future. So if we take a quick look into some of the aspects, if I sort of extract the social performance out of the triple bottom line and correlate that with ICT maturity, we can see that it's quite a steep curve in the beginning, and then it has a tendency maybe of flattening out a little bit. And I think there could be many different interpretations of this, but I think one reasonable explanation is that the social dimension is maybe slightly easier to target, and it's also maybe a little bit driven by individual initiatives and individual drive to improve your current situation, and thereby the whole situation in the city improves. So here I believe that it's more people that are driving the development maybe than institutions in that sense. Institutions are of course important, but they're not driving in the same sense, and ICT contributes to give the tools in the hands of people. If I take another dimension, which is then the economic competitiveness, which seems to follow a fundamentally different curve here, where we see that ICT maturity helps, but it takes quite some time before that kicks in. And we can sort of see the more profound impacts. And of course, I think that there's good reasons for this as well, because I think that economic competitiveness is something that is a bit tougher to achieve. It requires more from institutions and organizations and enterprises within the city to respond to this and to develop to this. So for me, this is quite natural that you could see these kind of differences in patterns. But it's of course important to see what can we do to improve the economic competitiveness, and can we sort of stimulate the discussion, particularly around the low-performing cities here, to run according to a faster trajectory then. Another thing that we can see, which is quite interesting, as Ola told us, we have published this report 5 years now. Last year, we went from the beta release to the real stuff, because last year we basically reshuffled or restructured the data model and created a much more robust model out of the learnings that we had in the 3 first years. And that is a data model that we have now also as a foundation for this report. And that means that we can start to make some comparisons. Still, from 1 year to another, it's a short time cycle. I don't think we should sort of take too much conclusions in the details here. But if you look at this diagram where you have ICT maturity improvements on the x-axis, and you have the actual ICT maturity on the y-axis. So that meaning that the city which is high up has a high ICT maturity. And here you find obviously Singapore, Stockholm, Copenhagen, the cities that you would expect. And lower ICT maturity, you have, I think it's Dhaka, Jakarta, Karachi, etc., which are the lower ICT maturity cities. But interestingly enough, we can see that the lower ICT maturity cities are the ones that are growing fastest now. So there is a little bit of a catch-up effect going on right now, where we see a much faster absorption of ICT in cities which are a little bit less developed. And it's even so that if I take Singapore as an example, Singapore has always been the sort of the prime example that we bring forward when we talk about the city and bringing ICT into practice. Singapore is actually the one city that is growing the lowest rate now in ICT maturity. So there is something now that some kind of a bottlenecks or some kind of a barriers that is stopping the development, or hindering development, which probably needs to be looked in quite carefully in Singapore to drive the development forward then. Stockholm, we'll come into Stockholm. I think Stockholm is performing quite well in relation to other cities of a similar maturity level, that Stockholm continues to improve its ICT maturity despite the very good position. But I think this calls for some discussions around, particularly the sort of more mature cities. What are the barriers? And my personal take on it is that we're probably seeing more challenges when you go into more mature use cases. And once again, Martin Ingvar explained that in a very good way, how difficult it is to sort of start to transform these systems. But he also explained, I think, the potential, if you can get this transformation to happen in the right way, it has could have a huge impact in terms of what output a given city or society will get from ICT. So my take on it is that we are sort of witnessing some of those barriers, and that's of course something that we need to deepen our understanding and deepen our discussion about as a basis of this. But we can also look into some of the basic research that we did for this year, because I mean every year we take a new look at the current state of knowledge, and we go through various kinds of reports, business reports, research reports, etc., around ICT and urban development. And there is, I think, it's a clear observation that we can see now that the debate or the discussion is shifting very much from previous years, where it was much about why do we need ICT and making the case that ICT actually has a good contribution. I think that debate is largely behind us now. It's much more a discussion about how. How can we take advantage of ICT, and how should we progress the development using ICT in a more intelligent way in that sense. And when we look a little bit deeper, I think that we identify two main parameters that comes in here. There is a long list of suggestions that you can read out of all of these different sources. But one thing that strikes us is around leadership. That we used to talk about ICT as sort of the issue for big visionary leadership, a very top-down kind of a leadership. But I think that is also shifting now, where it's more a matter of should I say, distributed leadership, where I think that ICT is becoming a part of the curriculum for leaders. As a leader, you need to know a little bit of legal, you need to know a little bit about human resources, you need to know a little bit about finance, and I would add ICT to that list. Because if you are not able to understand how you can use ICT to rationalize your operation and free up resources for more productive work, and if you don't know how to use ICT to increase engagement with your different stakeholders, your leadership task is going to be very tricky. And I think that including ICT usage and ICT knowledge into the leadership curriculums is something very important. One thought that comes through here is more of an entrepreneurial model, where the major is sort of driving an entrepreneurial agenda throughout the city organization to make more initiatives come through and be realized without necessarily waiting for the centrally orchestrated initiatives. That was maybe necessary when we rolled out the infrastructure, but now we use it, it becomes more of a natural thing. But also using ICT to open up for a broader engagement, where civic participation can happen across basically all kinds of borders. And I think that there are lots of examples where cities open up their ruling principles and let citizens participate in budgeting processes, in prioritization of where different resources shall be allocated from a repair and maintenance point of view, in policy making, invite people to participate in policy making, etc. So I think that is something which is also a common theme in terms of how the leadership of cities is changing to a much more open and transparent way of leading, and an inclusive way of leading. And then also, I think the informational ecosystem. Martin was into that when we talk about healthcare. I think it goes across more sectors than that it's a matter, and Rio de Janeiro is quite interesting, where they have this sort of the city operation center, where they are gathering information, both from their own operation, but also from business, from other sources, into more of a kind of a dashboard or a city management center, where decisions can be taken, and where also analysis can be made and predictions can be made, meaning that you can move from being more reactive to preventing. It can be in the traffic, it can be in different other areas where you can be much more proactive in your management of the city then. And from a collaboration point of view, I think that cities need to sort of work much more from sort of a platform thinking, where the city is providing some of those vital platforms where information can be exchanged, where the innovation community can be invited to solve some of the city challenges, develop applications, etc. Obviously open data, open governance, etc. are part of that into the picture. But I think also cities need to work much more on shared solutions. When I look, and now I come to one of my favorite topics here, when I walk around in Stockholm, sometimes I go by the bus or the subway, I use this blue card. It works quite okay in Stockholm, but if I go to Uppsala, they have a yellow card, so this won't work. If I go to Gothenburg, God knows what color they have. If I go to New York, it definitely doesn't work. And I know that the Stockholm public transportation company had quite a hassle to get this work, so they spent over budget a number of times to get this system working. And I bet they did the same in Uppsala, or I know that they did the same in Uppsala. And I trust that they did it in Gothenburg as well, and in New York as well. And my point is that when you try to solve your problems sort of city by city, you end up in solutions which might work quite okay in that particular city, but at a very high cost. And if you go back to the issue about standardization, if I pull this one out, this is the same. I'm as equally mobile with this as I am with this. This happens to work all over the place. I can turn this on anywhere, and it works. I may pay a little bit extra for a telephone call from New York than from Stockholm, but I can live with that. It could be the same here. And if we look at the cost of operating this system compared to the world's transport payment systems cost, I bet that there's at least two oceans in between, where the effectiveness and efficiency of operating this infrastructure is so much higher. And by this I mean that when you go into building cities on ICT infrastructure, we need to recognize that ICT scales in a fundamentally different way. And you cannot, in the same way, allow to build your own solutions, because they become expensive and they become unpractical to use in that sense. So I think that's very much about sort of creating shared solutions from a city point of view. Looking at this bigger picture, this leads us then to somewhat predictions, or three predictions from our side. And one, I think I've already touched upon, that collaboration is something that is going to change fundamentally. And I think once again what we heard about healthcare is just one way, where the patients are needs to be much more engaged into the whole process. And I think that goes across basically all sectors. But also that collaboration is changing the core of how you build an organization. Because in the future, I think we will see more temporary configurations where people are sort of extracting competences and resources more casually into a business which is run. If you look at the startups in Stockholm, the gaming companies and other companies, they are building an operation extremely lean and relying on getting resources, even funding through crowdfunding and those kind of solutions. And I think that ultimately that is going to make a call for changed legislation, changed rule setting in many aspects. I mean, the regulation around employment, for instance, is built very much about the old logic of what an enterprise or a company was. But I think also the legal frameworks for how you do the legal frameworks surrounding companies and accounting, etc., is all going to be affected by that. So I think this is a force that has a wide political implication, or a wide society implication at least, maybe not so political. The second prediction that we make is that people power is going to drive the urban development. And I think I made some points, but I think there are two aspects to this. One is that we see more and more cases, and I'm thinking about a case like Airbnb, for instance. I trust that you heard about Airbnb to get somewhere to stay when you are not away from home. And as we know, that started as a couple of guys in San Francisco solving a problem with not having money to pay the rent. So they built some kind of a solution to see, can we have somebody staying in our apartment overnight from time to time to get a little bit of an income? And so far it's all fine, but the interesting thing here is that with ICT that scales, and it only took a couple of years, and then you have a global sort of overnight platform where people that has a bed and people that need a bed effectively can meet each other. And if you look at Airbnb today, the latest valuation I saw of Airbnb, they're today valued higher than the world's largest hotel chain. And they are operating 3,250 hotels, and Airbnb is not operating one single hotel. So that is a little bit the impact of a couple of guys having a very everyday kind of a problem, and how the solution to that problem scales and creates a fundamental change agent and transformation force then into the hotel business, etc. The other aspect of people power, I think, is the opening up that I talked about, that governments and city authorities are opening up their way of operating the city into become much more open for suggestions, advices, and recommendations from citizens. So I think those two forces are two strong forces that will change the power play significantly in the industry, in cities. And the third one, which resonates partly with the other ones as well, is that we are a bit frustrated of GDP as a measure of economic terms. We use it in our index because that's the only thing we reasonably well could use, looking at all of those cities from different places. But GDP is a very linear model. Let me take one example. There's a number of car manufacturers that are providing complete solutions for a group buy of a car. So you can go together, I don't know, a couple of families or a couple of people, 4 or 5, and you buy a car and you have that as a shared car, and they have sort of the infrastructure, the services and the applications to be able to manage that in a good way. GDP counts that more or less as one car. But if you look at the value, the transport value that car produces in society, it's probably 3 times the original value that is captured through GDP. And the same if you go into other kind of sharing services where people are utilizing the same infrastructure, the same products, and starting to share that more effectively between each other. So our prediction is that we will see another term for economic growth and economic productivity. And it's probably the sooner the better, but that captures more of these circular kind of economies. Because if we don't have that, we're probably going to drive towards an old model which is not really in harmony with the needs of a more sustainable future that we have. So those, I leave those with you, those 3 predictions of how we see that sort of the urban landscape is changing quite fundamentally from that perspective. If we then go into sort of the core of the city ranking, and yes, Stockholm is still number 1. So I'm glad to be in Stockholm, of course, to tell that. It would have been very exciting if we'd have a lot of turbulence in the top here, but I think the nature of these kind of statistics is not that you can expect very big changes from one year to another. If I look at the top 5 cities, Singapore has surpassed, Paris has surpassed Singapore. Singapore used to be number 3, Singapore is now number 4. And that is mainly due to the issue I raised before, that Singapore has not really kept its momentum in ICT maturity. Singapore seems to be losing some momentum in that aspect, and that has costed one ranking points here in the ranking. We've added a couple of European cities. For those, I don't have sort of the backtracking for previous years, but they fit quite well into the upper mid layer here. Overall, we can see that the cities are coming together a little bit more, and that's due to the reasons I talked about. Before, I think we had a clearer sort of 3 tiers. We had a more low-performing cities, we had mid-performing cities, and high-performing cities. And I think our recommendations in terms of the low-performing cities still is that there is a focus on the individual usage that needs to be there. In the high-performing cities, I think it's more a focus on the barriers that I talked about before, the institutional, the legislative, the regulation, or the rule settings, business models, etc. So this is how it comes out, and I will soon hand over to Anette here to bring us a better picture about Stockholm. I just brought one more detailed picture of Stockholm, where you can sort of see how Stockholm is splitting in its performance when you look at it from the 6 different dimensions that I talked about. The top 3 being the triple bottom line: social, economic, and environmental. And then if you look at the 3 bottom is the ICT maturity, where it's, I mean, Stockholm performs quite evenly. Economy is a little bit lower. I think I talked about economic competitiveness, so it's more the economic output in Stockholm, GDP per capita, that is lagging a little bit compared to the other leading cities though. But this is basically the picture for Stockholm.